Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. I'm Andrew Gustafson,
And I'm Cindy Vanden
and we are excited to share with you today and celebrate the 197th birthday of Calvert Vaux. Some of you may be familiar with Calvert Vaux' work. Some of you may be familiar with it and not know that it's Calvert Vaux' work, but this is a person that we talk about a lot on our programs that we do, obviously of Prospect Park. And we wanted to kind of take a step back and look at his broader career and contribution, because he's a really interesting and significant figure in the history of American, not just landscape architecture, but architecture in general.
Yeah, and we're admirers of
Mhm.
Calvert Vaux, and a lot of times Olmsted, and rightfully so, Olmsted has left a big legacy.
Mhm.
But as we'll learn today, Calvert Vaux had an indelible mark on not just New York City, but really the country. And so we're excited to share some of the stories from his life and career with all of you today. And we're curious, for those of you who are watching, we'd love to engage with you in the chat today. So if you want to put in where you're tuning in from today, and whether you have an interest in Calvert Vaux or a connection in some way, we'd love to make this conversational, even though we're in a webinar format, because after all, we are tour guides. So we're here really as admirers of Calvert Vaux, not necessarily architectural historians, but certainly admirers.
And I do see some people on our participant list who do have connections, certainly to Olmsted and Olmsted Parks. But yeah, so drop your questions into the chat throughout. We also have closed captioning available as always. We're going to dive right into the program tonight. We're approaching the holiday season, as Marilyn just noted from our sweaters, obviously. So we're taking a little bit of a break from virtual programs for the next couple of weeks, but we will be back in January with a whole new lineup of more programs. And we were getting so excited and geared up for more in-person programs, and now things are like not looking great this winter on the COVID front, but fingers crossed that this is a temporary setback. But anyway, so keep your questions coming. And
Questions and comments.
And
because I'm sure
comments,
if
yep.
people have knowledge to share, please jump in and share. And you can click everyone, which will go so we can make it a conversation amongst everyone here.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so let's dive in here. When we talk about Calvert Vaux, it's almost always in the same breath as Frederick Law Olmsted, Olmsted and Vaux, Vaux and Olmsted. But we wanted to kind of separate the two figures today and really focus on the person here on the right. Why is Vaux so significant? Well, for one, he was, when we look at the projects that they did together, he was a major contributor both in terms of the architecture, because he was the trained architect. So if there's a building in an Olmsted Vaux Park, there's a good chance it's designed by Calvert Vaux.
Or a bridge.
Things like that. And number two, he was a huge contributor to just many different movements in the 1850s, 1860s, and into the 1870s in architecture and landscape architecture. He was the real prime proponent for building Central Park and for building public parks in general. And so we often think about Olmsted as the visionary, Vaux as the technician. I don't think that's correct. That's not the right way to separate them out. They were both visionaries, they were both artists, and they both had technical expertise in different areas. And so they made their own unique contributions to the projects they worked on, but of course had their own separate careers as well. And we'll talk about the ways in which their careers and contributions converged, but also diverged at different points in time.
And I think something that's interesting that to me at least is a theme that we see, whether it's from Central Park all the way into Vaux's later on in life, is you have Central Park as this democratizing kind of public space and the urban parks movement, and at the same time later on in his life he's really dedicated to designing for the poorest of the poor in New York City. And so we'll get a chance to kind of learn about that trajectory in his career, which is quite different than what we see. I mean, I think he and Olmsted shared those values,
Yeah, for sure.
but they sort of manifest themselves differently as they go along in their careers.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that we call this program Architect for the People, and we're going to talk about a lot of his the ways in which he contributed to public institutions in different ways, but a lot of his career was also designing stately homes for very rich people,
Well, this
which
is
is not, which definitely not buildings for the people, which we'll also talk about a little bit in the program today. But I think part of what distinguishes these two is also their biography and their background was very, very different. And so, yeah, why don't we start and talk a little bit about Vaux, the person. I should preface this by saying that another distinguishing feature between these two men was what we know about them, what has survived from their lives to this day. Charles Beveridge has been spending almost 50 years writing, the multi-volume collected works of Frederick Law Olmsted. And there's the National Association for Olmsted Parks. He has an enormous body of work. No one has done that for Calvert Vaux. There are a couple biographies from him about him. One I just want to point out. This one is called Country, Park and City. It's by Francis Kowski. It's a great book, but there's almost no detail about his early life and very few of his writings, and almost none of his artwork other than his architectural drawings have survived today.
And even if you go, as we have, down the rabbit hole on Ancestry.com on Calvert Vaux, there's very little about those early years.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of his early life is kind of a mystery. He did not write a lot about himself. Almost none of his personal papers survive, and none from his early career pre-Olmsted. None of those papers survive. So there's a very, very fragmentary documentary record that exists about Olmsted, exists about Vaux, excuse me. In contrast to Olmsted, who has this voluminous body of work that really helps us better understand him as a person, and not able to understand Vaux.
But there are some things we know.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah. So today's his birthday.
Yeah.
And he was born in 1824. And Cindy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, so we know that his father was a surgeon, and that his dad actually passes away when he's only 8 years old. We know that he had a brother who was born about 4 years later, and then had two sisters, and that he grew up not far from the London Bridge. And then his family moves, and it's unclear exactly where they're living. They might be living in South London, or at least he is by the time it's 1848. Shortly after his father's death, he enrolls in what was called the Merchant Taylors School and gets a classical education. Has a real interest at an early age in literature and art and history, and that, I think, really goes on to inform his career as he begins to apprentice in an architecture firm.
Yeah, and so he gets this classical training, and back in those days there were no architecture schools per se. You would apprentice with someone, and the typical path was to apprentice for 5 or 6 years, right? And he only did 3 years apprenticeship with Lewis Cottingham, who was a well-known architect for restoring Gothic buildings, and
like medieval churches.
Yeah, medieval churches, things like that. But for some reason, Vaux leaves that apprenticeship early. Probably a good thing. Cottingham dies shortly thereafter. His son takes over the firm and runs it into the ground, and actually tries to then make his fortune in America after sort of ruining his reputation, but dies in a steamship accident on the Atlantic crossing. So, but Vaux is sort of bouncing around in architectural circles. He is a member of something called the Architectural Association, which is really significant because this was created in London by young architects. Because there is no formal professional training other than apprenticeship, many people felt sort of locked out of the profession. It wasn't necessarily a meritocracy. If you didn't have the connections to get those apprenticeships, then you couldn't practice. And so the Architectural Association was trying to sort of build a network of young architects and professionalize the industry.
And this is a time when he's really making friendships and connections. And George Truefit, who is an architect and goes on to do all kinds of buildings in England and Scotland. The two of them go on a walking tour in Europe together.
Yeah.
And while none of Vaux's sketches remain from that time, in the summer of 1846, the two of them go exploring in France, Germany, and Belgium. And that is purportedly a time that had real influence on both of their perspectives on architecture.
And so another parallel as well is with Olmsted and Vaux is that a few years later, Olmsted would famously go on a tour of England, what that would really influence his view on parks. But yeah, so during this period, 1846, 47, 48, and actually up until about 1850, it's not really clear what he's doing professionally. We do know that he was working as a letterer, where he was known for his penmanship, and a talent that he had was the ability to write backwards, which was highly valued by lithographers because they would have to take images and reverse them. So he would work for cartographers and lithographers, writing the writing like on maps, say backwards.
So. And that was a detail that I guess his son had shared.
Yeah,
got documented. So that's the kind of thing that's so interesting.
That's kind of how he supported himself, as far as we know. Again, and a lot of this account comes from his son, but we also know that there are things that his son Downing, recounted that were not totally accurate based on other things we knew about Vaux. But yeah, so we're going to get in just a moment to the American chapter in his life. But I just wanted to point this out. I thought this is so funny because when I was doing research for this program, I looked at Calvert Vaux's Wikipedia page. And I don't know who did this or when this was edited, but it says Calvert Vaux is an English-American architect and landscape designer, best known as the co-designer, along with his protege and junior partner, Frederick Law Olmsted, of what would become New York City Central Park. So I did not vandalize Wikipedia with this, but I think it's actually pretty accurate, especially when we talk about the early period of their partnership. But we're still a few years away from that now. But his first partnership was with this person, Andrew Jackson Downing. So as you mentioned, Vaux was a member of the Architectural Association in London, and they would put on shows as a way to showcase the work of their members who didn't have access to other venues because they were sort of in some ways locked out of the profession. And so there was a display put on. Also, it was in partnership with the Watercolor Society.
I think that's what it's called. The New Society of Watercolor Painters.
There you go. And so Vaux had a number of works on display. This happened to be a time when this person, Andrew Jackson Downing, was visiting England. And he had come to Europe specifically to find himself an architect. In many ways, Andrew Jackson Downing is considered the father of American landscape architecture, though he was not an architect or even a landscape architect. He's also variously described as a publicist, as a tastemaker. But what he was well known for was popularizing the concept of sort of the cottage and garden. And he was a designer of country homes. And so he wrote a series of books about country homes, and also edited a magazine called The Horticulturist, which we'll also talk about a little bit later on. But he was very much a proponent of creating a uniquely American sort of pastoral style of architecture and integrating architecture into the surrounding landscape. And so Andrew Jackson Downing wanted to expand his practice. He was based out of Newburgh, New York, and he realized he needed a skilled architect to do that. He had collaborated with other architects of this sort of antebellum period, one of them being another person with the middle name Jackson, actually with the same initials, Alexander Jackson Davis, who was also a very well-regarded architect of this time for designing stately homes. But Davis was sort of, they kind of had a falling out, and Downing didn't really like his style, and Davis actually rejected Downing in their partnership, and so he needs to find himself an architect, and he thought the best way to do that would be to find a professional in Europe. He just so happens to go to this exhibition where he meets Vaux, who reportedly gave him a tour and really highlighted his own paintings, and Downing basically hires him on the spot. And shortly thereafter, they're on a steamboat out of Liverpool and headed back to New York together. And so they come back to the U.S. in September, and by the end of the year, they're full partners in the firm of Downing and Vaux.
And what this says to me also, just knowing about Vaux, and is that he really is also an artist in a way.
Oh,
and
for
that he
sure.
brings that to the table.
Yeah, and we'll talk about his collaboration with artists as well throughout his career. But he was very, he also became very much, a part of the American artist scene as well throughout his life. So, one thing that Downing is also well known for is being the principal proponent of public parks, and especially the first public park in America, which is Central Park. And so he sort of lays out his argument for why we need more public parks in this article that's published in The Horticulturist. And it's published as a conversation between a traveler, someone who had traveled to Europe, like Downing, and seen many of the great parks there, and sort of a questioner. And here you can see sort of the crux of his argument. He said, "There is, to my mind, but one effectual and rational mode of doing this, creating parks, by a voluntary taxation on the part of all the inhabitants. A few shillings each person, or a small percentage on the value of all the property in a town, would keep a park of 100 or 200 acres in admirable order and defray all the incidental expenses. Did you ever make a calculation of the sum voluntary paid in towns like this of 9,000 inhabitants for pew rent in churches and places of worship?" And so he was really, pushing for shifting away from this mode of just having sort of stately manners, which may have some public access, which had been the mode for a long time in Europe, really up until the 1830s, when we had the creation of the first public parks there, bringing that model of places like Birkenhead Park in England to the United States. So he was very much a proponent, like as Cindy mentioned before, of democratizing parks. And this was a sort of torch that Vaux would carry on.
In a way for Downing.
Yeah,
right?
for Downing.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that in a minute. But one of the principal things that Downing and Vaux did was again design stately homes and the grounds around them. So they mostly concentrated in upstate New York. That's where their main business was. But they were starting to expand. And actually, the last project that they did together was designing this Beechwood mansion in Newport, which was designed for a New York financier, Daniel Parrish. This was actually the first Newport mansion. Parrish was actually the one who was really pushing to get rich people to spend their summers in Newport. And so this sort of began the craze that would continue into the 20th century of mansion building by the rich and famous in Newport. But Beechwood Mansion would be the first one. So Downing and Vaux designed this in 1852. It says 1856 because the building actually burned down a couple years later, and then it was reconstructed by Vaux to basically the same exact design.
I like to play. I mean, what I think is interesting is also placing them. Where are they doing this work? And they're actually between September of 1850 and July of 1852. Vaux is living at Downing's estate.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they are working together and creating, this mansion as well as other estates
And
together in that space, in a living space together.
And of course, Downing's estate was sort of where he was experimenting with a lot of his ideas. Highland Park, it was called in Newburgh. Sort of similar when we think about Olmsted and his Tassamock Farm in Staten Island, where he was sort of experimenting as well. And we'll talk about where they all intersect in a couple minutes. But why is this the last project, you may be asking? And that's because of what happens in July of 1852. Downing is actually on his way to Newport. He's going to stop at a few other places on his way, but eventually he's going to Newport to meet with Parrish to discuss the final designs for that mansion. And when they're heading down the Hudson River Downing is heading down the Hudson River on the steamboat Henry Clay, just off of Yonkers, the boiler explodes and the boat catches fire. Downing actually manages to escape the fire. He jumps in the river and he actually could swim quite well. But in attempting to rescue a woman who could not, they end up both getting dragged down together and he drowns. So this is a massive blow, obviously, personally for Downing and Downing's family, but Vaux as well. But they were full partners at this time, and so Vaux tries to carry the firm on. So for a short period of time, it continues to carry the name of both of them, but eventually Vaux would take on a new partner in the form of Withers, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the projects.
And then the firm becomes Vaux and Withers, and so it's too hard for them to stay in Downing's home, and they end up setting up shop at the David Crawford House, which today is, interestingly, the Historical Society of Newburgh and the Highlands. And so we can see the outside of the house here. And they continue to design these sort of stately homes and grounds of wealthier merchant families.
And just to be clear, this is not a Vaux building. This is much predates Vaux.
Oh, yes,
This was the building that was their office.
Yeah, so they move in there. That's right. Yeah. But the next oh yes. Oh. And so this.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about during this period as well. It's just significant because we mentioned before how connected, that Vaux himself was an artist and he became connected to the art world, specifically with the Hudson River School. And obviously, he is part of this movement called the American picturesque style of landscape architecture, which is designing buildings and the landscapes around them to look like paintings, right? So doing this sort of composition. But, he was a painter himself, and he actually married into a family of painters as well. So he marries Mary
Swan McKenty.
Mary Swan McKenty, who is the sister of Jervis McKenty, who is one of the sort of leading lights of the Hudson River School in the mid 19th century. So you can see one of his paintings here. This is not Newburgh Rondout, that's Kingston, right? So it's but not too far away.
And this is the two of them during the 1850s. They're having children as well. So they have two sons and two daughters. I, as we were researching for this program, we came across a project that we wanted to share with you, an effort to sort of preserve Calvert Vaux's story and legacy, which we're excited to share. And so this here is a seminal work that does remain of Calvert Vaux, Villas and Cottages. And so he publishes this in 1857 as a reflection of a lot of his works at the time. And so these are the sketches. This is the record that we can really rely upon as we look back at his career. But this is still so early in his career.
Yeah, and in many ways, this is sort of an updated edition of a series of books that Downing had done. So again, highlighting the different sort of works in this American pastoral style that Downing and Vaux were working in. But Calvert Vaux, basically completely revamps the volume and puts in a lot of his own work into it as well. But yeah, and I think when you look at this, you can just see like this looks a lot like structures I've seen in Central Park and Prospect Park.
Right.
So these kind of rough-hewn wood structures, again, and sort of these rustic pastoral, sort of recreating, buildings of the countryside. Um,
And so I'd just like to share here, Design 31 in this space is what is now called the Point and Hoyt House. And there is a group that's trying to, it's an organization that's trying to restore this building, which was commissioned by a New York merchant. So they commissioned Vaux and Withers to design this house and the grounds.
mhm,
And they're trying to establish a cultural institution that will interpret Calvert Vaux's life as well as his role in the American picturesque movement
mhm.
of this time period that Andrew so eloquently described. And so this is really sort of a Calvert Vaux kind of a project, and hopefully we'll show you here. This is some of the recent work that they've done over the last couple of years.
And
This
you
is
can
the
see,
main mansion and entrance that they just recently restored.
and you can see what rough shape the building in the left is in. So many of the buildings that were designed during this period, by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Clark Withers, don't survive. Um, they even during this time built a few buildings in New York City as well, and eventually they would move their practice to New York City. But yeah, this is one of the kind of most intact buildings of this time period that's still around.
Yeah, and it's located in Stottsburg, in the Hudson Valley,
Mhm.
and we encourage you. It's not just this mansion that he designed, but there's also a barn on the grounds, which we can see here, as well as other structures, and then the landscape
Mhm.
sort of planning from the time period. So they're positioning this project really as a seminal work that helped to prepare Calvert Vaux for what would be an important project within the next few years of building this, which would be Central Park,
Mhm.
where he's joined up by Olmsted.
So
And so we encourage you to support this organization. You can visit their website and just look for them at the Calvert Vaux Preservation Alliance. They have a lot of work to do. So they've done the entrance, but there's
mhm,
all kinds of restoration underway. They're doing research and interpretive planning. So we encourage you to support them.
yeah. Um, so since you mentioned Central Park, we should mention how um, Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, came together for this project. But their association goes back a few years. As you mentioned before, Andrew Jackson Downing was the editor of the Horticulturist, and at this time, Frederick Law Olmsted, he lived on Staten Island. He was running a farm, but he was also a writer. And so he had actually traveled to Newburgh because he was getting interested in architecture and horticulture. And so he wanted to pitch article ideas to Andrew Jackson Downing. And it just so happened that his partner, Calvert Vaux, was there. And so this was the first occasion that the two of them met. Wasn't sort of earth shattering, wasn't particularly memorable to either of the men. But this was the product of it, and this was the first article that Frederick Law Olmsted wrote in the Horticulturist, a note on the true soldat-laborer pair. But you can see that appeared in January of 1852. So their paths wouldn't cross for several more years, really until we get into Central Park. So Central Park, this idea had been percolating for a number of years. It took a while to get the city on board, and eventually what happens in 1856 is the land has been set aside, and they have a chief engineer, a guy by the name of Egbert Ville, and the mayor just says, yeah, sure, your plan is fine. And they just approve this plan. And so this, you can see it's June 3rd of 1856. This is kind of where Calvert Vaux steps onto the scene because he is incensed. He thinks this plan is absolutely terrible. And I want to read a quote from a letter that he wrote at the time. So again, this comes from Francis Kowski's book, but let me read it to you here. So he writes this in June of 1856, so shortly after this plan is released. He says, being thoroughly disgusted with the manifest defects of Villers' plan, I pointed out whenever I had a chance that it would be a disgrace to the city and to the memory of Mr. Downing, who had first proposed the location of a large park in New York, to have this plan carried out. So he begins a campaign over the next year to get the city of New York to reject this plan and instead hold a competition. And so eventually a competition is announced in late 1857. Now, in the intervening time, this is when Olmsted enters the scene, because Frederick Law Olmsted, he's become interested, with Tassamock Farm, interested in landscape architecture. And so he applies.
And he needs money.
And he
needs to make money.
Yes. His publishing business has not done well, but he has started to sort of cultivate, connections and a client base for his sort of design services in Staten Island. Specifically, he's neighbors with some Vanderbilts. That sort of helps.
George Putnam.
Yeah, George Putnam. And actually, it's funny. So he applies to be the superintendent for Central Park. So he'd be overseeing the construction of the park. He writes letters to many people that he knows, asking them to sort of write him a letter of recommendation for this, including people who he acknowledges he lost a lot of their money in his publishing business. So he was, Frederick Law Olmsted was not shy about asking, what do they say, leaning in, right? He was not shy about that. It's interesting, though. I want to mention just a little detail about that sort of aspect of their character. As we mentioned, Frederick Law Olmsted has a massive body of work. He was famous, world famous in his own lifetime. But in 1857, when Villas and Cottages is printed, an architectural critic named Clarence Cook, who had actually worked in the firm of Downing and Vaux, he writes a review, actually in Putnam's.
Okay, there we go.
In Olmsted's magazine. He writes a review of Villas and Cottages, and he says, Mr. Vaux's book, and we wish to do him no injustice, is too full of egotism. And he says, in comparison to Downing's modesty, which never allowed him to speak an unnecessary word about himself, and which touched even his satire with good nature. So at this point, Downing is almost a sort of beatified figure in American architecture who could do no wrong. And so this actually hurt Vaux very, very deeply. And as Kowski mentions in her book, it says Vaux was troubled by the accusation of self-promotion. And that may be something he carried on for the rest of his life, because he was oftentimes very, very timid in promoting himself. But I think we can also see that he was sometimes quite acerbic in his criticism of Villers. So
he's also characterized by some historians as an introvert. And so that's another thing, is that you have Olmsted, who's never afraid to express his viewpoints or express himself. And it seems like here we have Vaux as sort of a more reserved person.
Yeah. But we also see that Olmsted was a very politic person. He was very good at sort of, and we see that in in different projects that they did, that often Olmsted would sort of insert himself between, the paymasters and Vaux to sort of smooth things over. He's a very diplomatic person. But this is all conjecture as well, because again, we know so little about Vaux's life just based on what other people wrote about him. But we just want to check the chat right here. Yes, that's right. So if we go back, I just want to note Howard's comment where it says here, Southside Staten Island as Olmsted's address. That's right. So which today we know as the Eltingville neighborhood in southern Staten Island, which is where Tassamock Farm, now known today as the Olmsted Beale House, is located. I see we have some Olmsted Beale House folks who are joining us today. And yeah, so a little so about this design of Central Park. So where were we? So it's 1857. Vaux is petitioning to get a competition created. Olmsted, meanwhile, is applying to be superintendent. He does eventually get that job. And the competition is announced, and that's when Vaux approaches Olmsted to go in with him on it, because Olmsted is the superintendent of construction. So he's surveying the grounds. He knows the lay of the land.
He's also reporting to Egbert Villay.
Yes, and also knows that Egbert Villay is not giving correct information to the competitor. So basically the base map of the topography of the area is not correct. And Olmsted knows this. So that sort of gives them an inside track. But again, it's not something that Olmsted could have done alone. He's not an architect, but he has this insider knowledge that Vaux doesn't have as well.
And Villay in 1857 becomes a founding member of the American Institute.
No, Vaux, you mean.
What did I say?
You said Villay. The other V. Yeah.
Vaux is a founding member of the American Institute of Architects. You know, the two of them team up. And one of the details I love in Justin Martin's book, in the Genius of Place, is how, this one right here, is how as they're putting together their plan, these artists come over, friends, and they have them draw trees, and they have them make an absolutely beautiful plan.
So here we can see, so this is the plan that they come up with, which is submitted on March 31st. Of the 33 designs that are submitted, it is the last one that is submitted.
And it's after the
deadline.
It was after the deadline, but they were able to get a janitor to open the door, take their plans, and put them on the desk.
Yes. This is obviously not the original Greensward plan. You can see it on display in the Arsenal in Central Park, but this is a later print that was made, but I think it's a little clearer to see, which is why we used it from 1865. But you can see all the little details in there, including like the mall over here and all these wonderful bridges. I spent the other day just walking around this corner of Central Park down here. So this is the first portion of the park to open. And there you can see the Arsenal, which was a pre-existing structure down here. But yeah, I love that story about, you know, they were basically cramming, like rushing to finish.
Draw 2 more trees.
Yeah. So their plan is ultimately accepted, and you know, they begin their formal partnership of working on Central Park. So they would work on Central Park for the next couple of years together. Olmsted, of course, would leave during the Civil War to
work for the U.S.
United States Sanitary Commission. Basically, again, I think one of his unique contributions that he made to their partnership was ability to manage people and logistics, and that's something he did during the Civil War. But Vaux continued working on the construction of Central Park, which continued during the war, and really his crowning achievement, maybe of his entire career, is Bethesda Terrace, which was largely completed by 1864, which has this, you know, beautiful columned arcade with these encaustic tiles on the ceiling, and of course this beautifully frames the Bethesda fountain, which you can see. And again, I just took this picture the other day, but it's that, you know, we do a whole program just talking about all of the details in Bethesda Terrace. Now this is something that they did not alone. Again, Olmsted and Vaux were also working with another architect who was not a formal partner, but Vaux would continue to work with throughout the rest of his career, basically, which is Jacob Ray Mould, who designed a lot of the details of Bethesda Terrace as well as other parts of Central Park. But you wanted to add something, Cindy?
Oh, I was just going to say, one of my most vivid memories of going to Bethesda Terrace was when we did the all-night bicycle ride with historian Kenneth Jackson.
Yeah, that's where we started, right?
And we started at Columbia University.
Oh, we started at Columbia, right?
And we were there maybe at 11:30 at night. He was there with his megaphone and 100 students, and it was incredible.
Yeah. And again, if you find a building in Central Park that dates to the early period of the park, there's a good chance it was designed by Vaux and maybe Mould as well. This is one of them, a building that doesn't exist anymore, but this is the Springwater House. And of course, the dairy. And I think you can see this um, again, this rustic style that brings together a lot of different sort of folk art elements. And Vaux incorporated a lot of different styles, borrowing sort of styles from sort of Nordic vernacular architecture, but also, Moorish and Persian. One thing that he resisted throughout his career, and we'll see the consequence that would have, was just straight up neoclassical, which would very much come into vogue in the 1880s, which we'll see with some later projects. Now, after their sort of triumph in Central Park, they would eventually move on to Prospect Park, but not after having to again discard a design made by Egbert Ville.
Poor guy.
So Ville was commissioned to create this plan for Prospect Park in 1861. And this was sort of put on the back burner because of the Civil War. When it's revisited in 1865 by the Brooklyn Parks Commissioners, it's rejected. And they say, excuse me, rather than have a competition, let's just hire Olmsted and Vaux.
Well, Vaux convinces,
Yeah.
Actually, at this point, Olmsted's out in Mariposa, California, right. And Vaux is the one that advocates, really talks to the commissioners and is like, you should reconsider the plan. Let me submit something. Yep. And then there's these correspondences between him and Olmsted, and he's trying to convince Olmsted to come back. Yep. To team up again on another park right. in Brooklyn. So that's
and so this is what they create. Some of the significant features that differ. For one, if we look at the previous plan, you can see Flatbush Avenue running diagonally through the middle of the park. And so on the left is that area today. Part of that is Mount Prospect Park, but that's also where we find the Brooklyn Museum and Brooklyn Botanic Garden. But they basically shift the entire plan to the other side of Flatbush Avenue and sort of discard this area, move the park further south. And they want to build a large lake like they had built in Central Park, in large measure because they wanted to have ice skating in the park, which had become hugely popular in Central Park. But it also allowed them to create a much, much larger open space up here, which would become the centerpiece of Prospect Park, which is the Long Meadow.
And they really have this vision of positioning this as a center, a cultural center, and like the lungs of Brooklyn, the city of Brooklyn, with the parkways then that extend out almost as spokes.
Yeah, that's right. So this is sort of the beginning of their ideas of park system, which they would develop with other cities later on. But yeah, later you would see that the construction of Eastern Parkway and Ocean Parkway connecting the park here. One thing I want to mention about the Long Meadow is that this is often viewed as sort of, this was Olmsted right here. But again, when we look at the background of Vaux and his origins in the American picturesque movement, you have to believe that Vaux was also a major contributor to this idea of creating, using these different elements, like the berm that surrounds the Long Meadow, creating grade separation, creating sound attenuation, drawing people's attention in one direction to create a larger sense of space. That this was not just something that Olmsted kind of came up with whole cloth on his own, but was really a product of their collaboration. You can still see some Vaux structures in Prospect Park, but for one, some of them didn't survive, or two, they weren't constructed because basically in 1872, they stopped building new structures in Prospect Park for an extended period of time due to some economic difficulties. One of the ones you can see that's still largely intact is the well house, which was used to power the massive well that provided water for all the water features in the park. The other is the Concert Grove Pavilion, which its counterpart, which was the restaurant or the casino, which is behind it, doesn't survive anymore. But this is a beautiful structure where you can again see those different architectural influences.
And it's newly restored.
And it was newly restored. Yep, we did a program about
that.
that. So we don't need to go into all the details
Right.
about it. But here on the right, you can see the restaurant that accompanied it. That was torn down in the 1940s. So another Vaux building that's lost. Here you can see it again. Again, there's beautiful cutout details in here. And then, of course, the dairy. Now, we often think of, because Central Park is older, that is the originator of the dairy concept. But actually, the Prospect Park Dairy is older. I believe it was completed 1 year earlier.
We just learned that.
Yeah, just learned that. But again, the dairy was created, number one, as part of creating, what would you find in, an idyllic countryside? You would find a cottage, a stone cottage that might have some farm animals there. But it was also developed as sort of a public health initiative, as a place where people could get fresh milk straight from the cow, because a lot of milk available at the time was adulterated. Another cool thing about this building is that it was actually constructed from stone that was blasted from the construction of Prospect Park. So they actually took stone directly from the park to build the building. While they kept the one in Central Park, this one was torn down in 1935 by Robert Moses when he took over the Parks Department. It had fallen into disrepair and the cows were long gone. But
yeah,
during this period as well, so while they're working on Prospect Park, they're still continuing to do construction in Central Park. They also get a commission to design the park system for Buffalo, New York. And many people consider this to be one of their greatest accomplishments in their partnership. The map here, this is 1883, which is when the map was from, but they initially proposed this plan in 1868 while they're still working together, and they would continue to work on it even after their partnership dissolved just a couple of years later. So 1872, the firm of Vaux and Olmsted ceases to be. They apparently left on good terms. I think there was a little bit of animosity or resentment on the part of Vaux, because it was continually happening where people would talk about Central Park as being designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Frederick Law Olmsted alone.
And Olmsted is becoming more and more visible. Like breakaway Republicans nominate him to be vice president. Like in that same year,
yes,
their interests maybe are going in different directions by this point in time.
Yes, and they also eventually are removed from Central Park as well, in part due to political considerations. When Tammany Hall ascends to power again, they kind of lose their position. So their partnership dissolves. I mean, to his credit, Olmsted, at least early on, did speak quite vociferously about how they co-designed the parks. I don't think he ever said that he was the protege and junior partner of Vaux, but he did. But eventually, at some point, he kind of stops doing that. But anyway, so in 1872, their partnership dissolves. One of the first big projects that Vaux does on his own was design this building, again, where you can see this unbelievable, Moorish style architecture, which this is Olana. So this is the home of another Hudson River School painter, Frederick Church, which is in near Hudson, New York. So really, really remarkable. And I think, one of the high points definitely of his career.
We did a tour of this a few years ago.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. That's where I took this picture. And he gets some pretty high profile commissions, but they don't all go great.
Well, and the other thing about these commissions is that we can't see them anymore, which is so frustrating.
You can and you can't. Yeah. So, I mean, one that you definitely can't see was, he gets the commission to build the Centennial Exposition Hall in Philadelphia, which is supposed to be built by 1876. He actually designs the whole thing, submits the drawings, and it's rejected. So he loses that commission. He had actually also, back with Downing, they submitted a design for the exposition of the industry of all nations. I forget what it was
Mhm.
called, the exact detail, the exact name, in 1852, which instead they chose the Crystal Palace, which was built on the site of West City Bryant Park. So he tried to design a couple major expositions, but
No
the
dice.
no dice. He does get hired by the American Museum of Natural History. He designs the first wing of the museum, which you can see here. Um, Again, it's not hugely popular. People describe it as sort of a factory-like setting. It's kind of almost claustrophobic. It's got these. It's just like narrow hallways with like glass cases inside of it. So they move in a completely different direction. You can still see that wing though. It's right here,
Oh, it's
sort
so
of nestled
interesting.
into, when we know the facade of the American Museum of Natural History is most definitely, which is over here.
So is this when you go inside, are you inside of this building?
No,
Is that
the main entrance is over
oh,
here. This is
okay.
Central Park West.
Okay. I wonder what wing that is. I don't know. I actually don't know.
Yeah, but obviously, a building that's very much more in the sort of city beautiful style, when the rest of it is completed later in the 19th century. Similarly, he gets commissioned to build the first wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Again, it doesn't go over very well, and so they go with different architects to build the remainder of it.
And that's currently not visible. You can't
You
necessarily
can
like,
actually see that, but only from inside of the building.
right,
So there are
right.
portions where you can see it inside. It's sort of this red stone structure, but it's completely sort of subsumed into the rest of the complex. The last structure he would design for Prospect Park was actually long after the partnership with Olmsted dissolved. He designs the Terrace Bridge, which is, I think this is one of the most beautiful views in Prospect Park right here. So he does that in 1889. And actually Olmsted is commissioned.
Olmsted?
Yeah, Olmsted is commissioned to do more work on Prospect Park because this is when they're redesigning what would later be known as Grand Army Plaza. And Olmsted actually tries to push to get them to hire Vaux as well. But Vaux has kind of lost favor within the Parks Commission. The main patron for both Olmsted and Vaux had been a guy named James S.T. Stranahan. And sort of after he left is when they fell out of favor. But Vaux couldn't kind of get his foot back in the door with Prospect Park. And so Olmsted does some of the site planning by himself for Grand Army Plaza.
Was Vaux a commissioner for like parks for a time?
So this is also a period when he actually, well, we'll get to that a little bit later on, but a lot of the work that he, basically the last decade and a half of his life, he's an architect for the New York City Parks Department, but not in Brooklyn, because remember, they're separate cities at this time.
Okay.
So he can't get his foot back in the door in Brooklyn. He still has some connections in Manhattan. So in the early 1880s, he becomes the architect for the New York City Parks Department. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But let's talk about the work that he did for the Children's Aid Society, much of which still stands today in Manhattan.
Yeah, I find this so interesting, this period in his career where we still see remnants in various places in New York City of Calvert Vaux's architectural designs in the latter part of his career, including this building that we're seeing here, the Tompkins Square Lodging House for Boys and Industrial School. So there's a stretch in his career really from 1879 to, I believe, 1892, where he and his partner, who was George Kent Radford, who was really a civil engineer and oversaw the structural elements, while Vaux oversaw the architectural designs and details. And they were contracted by Charles Loring Brace, who had overseen the Children's Aid Society, really dating back to the 1850s. And so the Children's Aid Society had an interest in having him design lodging houses, schools for children who were really the poorest of the poor. And I just want to say a few things about a couple of these projects. So it appears, I think, that 6 of the 12 buildings that they designed in this time period remain in New York City. Of the one that we're looking at here, There's a little bit of a description of what it was like when you stepped inside. I worked at the Tenement Museum. I like to feel like I can inhabit these spaces and places. And so this was meant to be a space where newsboys or boys who were homeless had a place that they could go to learn skills or even take out loans. And so it's sort of described here, stepping in, it says, this is kind of sad, but it says the grimy little newsboys and their rivals in trade, the bootblacks, will be compelled to descend a flight of steps leading from the street into a little courtyard from which they will gain access to the basement of the building, passing first into a large reception room and thence into a spacious and very useful washroom adjoining, which is to be supplied with foot baths, plunge baths, and all necessary appliances for removing the traces of toil from the boys and fitting them to enjoy society. After they went to the restroom, they could progress to a playroom on the ground floor, which was really the basement, or ascend up to a stairway to a first floor dining room. And then on the second floor, there was a gathering hall for entertainment and instruction. And then on the upper stories, there were dormitories that were furnished with iron bunks. What I find so interesting is that they actually have loans to these boys. So the boys would pay to stay in lodging houses, and for their education. They would take out loans and then go out and work as bootblacks and other things. So this is this time period where you have this idea of the sort of worthy poor and the undeserving poor. But it's the Children's Aid Society is one of the early kind of innovators when we think about trade schools, or it's the precursor to kindergarten, or even, this is the organization that has the dark history to a certain extent of sending some of these children on trains out to the Midwest on these orphan trains to be placed with families, which is kind of a precursor to the foster care system.
Yeah.
And so you have kind of these elements, and you can see here the contrast between this lodging house and the tenements that sit beside it. It's really just on the corner of Avenue B and East 8th Street, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see how they're trying to make this look he's trying to make it look like a country inn, which is something that he communicated. I want this to be a place with a lot of light that feels like an escape from the tenements. And so we can see here another example. This was the Elizabeth Home for Girls, and this was purportedly for girls who had been in situations of domestic abuse. Here they would come to stay, and there was lodging, but they would also in this space there was a lounge. There were 6 private rooms. I like this detail. They were named Daisy, Pansy, and Forget Me Not. There were 58 beds in total, and this was a place where they got not only lodging, but they also got job training and what were called healthy communal activities that would help them kind of connect with other young girls and women, and develop skills in a various range of industries: sewing, lace work, pattern making, that sort of thing. The 14th Ward Industrial School, this was built to replace what was one of the original industrial schools of the organization, and it was the first one by the Children's Aid Society that was planned solely as a school and not a lodging facility. And so this was, these organizations, now today it's a co-op, but we can see the building here. And again, you can see how the architecture is set apart from these sort of tenement buildings of the time period that were so associated with challenges with public health and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one other thing. So in addition to making, designing these homes, these buildings for charitable organizations, that he was still working and making stately homes.
Which is actually how he got the contract, because he designed a mansion for Charles Loring Brace before this.
Yeah. But one from this period I just want to mention here is the National Arts Club. He didn't design this building. This was the home of Samuel J. Tilden. It was built in 1845, but in the 1880s, he basically combined 2 of the buildings and redid the interiors. This one is significant because, the architectural drawings for Prospect Park have not survived. And so when they've done restoration work, this is actually a building that they've turned to because some of the elements of Vaux's style have survived. One of them being this beautiful stained glass skylight, which is over the bar. I got to go to an event in the National Arts Club. Normally, you're not allowed in the bar, but that's how I took this picture the other day. You can actually see the holiday decorations in the top left.
It's stunning.
But yeah, it's amazing. But just as we get towards the end here, as we mentioned, Vaux spent the latter part of his career working as an architect, sort of in-house architect for the New York City Parks Department. You can still see a couple of his parks that have survived. One is Canal Park, which was only restored about 15 years ago. It had sat vacant as like an empty lot for about 80 years, but they did a restoration of it back in 2005. And you can see it sits right on the water there on Washington. And then the other is Mulberry Bend Park, which you've probably never heard of because now it is known as Columbus Park. So a pretty significant park in Lower Manhattan, also designed by Vaux towards the end of his life. But as we're just about out of time, we should talk about the end of Calvert Vaux's life, which is quite sad. And that he died at the age of just 71, drowning. His body was found in Gravesend Bay, basically Coney Island Creek, in November of 1895. It's still, like so much of his life, his death is also a mystery. It's not known exactly what happened, if he fell. Some people, there was conjecture at the time that he committed suicide, though his family has always denied that. So it's not really known what happened. Perhaps he did fall and wasn't able to get out of the water and drowned. He was we should mention, he was quite a diminutive man as well. He was under 5 feet tall.
Yeah.
So it's not really known what happened to him, but his life was unfortunately cut short.
Right. There was conjecture that he had, taken his own life, but he was living with his one of his children at the time and their family, and they said that there was no indication that they could see that would be the case.
Although, some people did say at the time that he had fallen ill. So you can say, he says, it's supposed he fell off the pier in an attack of dizziness or faintness.
Yeah.
So it's a very sad end to his life. And what's also sad is that he's not remembered, I think, in the way that he deserves to be remembered for his contributions to, as an Englishman, to American architecture, and especially to our parks. So he's definitely one of the major figures of the 19th century. I think what happened is really that he kind of got left behind in his style. And again, we don't always want to compare and contrast Olmsted and Vaux, but Olmsted is definitely someone who adapted his style. So when the City Beautiful movement came along and sort of overtook this American picturesque movement, Olmsted very much embraced it, and Vaux didn't in the same way. But again, a lot of this is conjecture about why their careers went in different directions.
And some of that, as now when you look at the buildings, maybe in that time period it felt like they were getting out of date, but as we look to the past and you see these buildings do remain, they're beautiful. They're really beautiful pieces of architecture, and I'm so grateful some of them are preserved.
Yeah. And when we look at Prospect Park and Central Park, I think in many ways we kind of lament some of the additions that were made in the late 19th century that are kind of out of place and don't totally fit with the design and vision of the parks. Adding these monumental structures, these whether it's, we love the horse tamers and the panthers and the eagles and stuff, but it's very much out of sync with what Olmsted and Vaux were going for. And the two of them, pushed back on that as much as they could. But again, certainly Vaux had kind of lost a lot of his influence by the 1880s. So we just want to thank everybody so much for joining us. I hope you found this talk interesting. Hopefully you'll go and check out the Vaux Preservation Society.
Oh, the Calvert Vaux Preservation Society.
Yep.
And the project is called the Point Hoyt House. Definitely support them. It seems like it's a relatively young effort, new effort. They've received some state funding and grants from various organizations, and we hope that you'll support them as they research his life and
Mhm.
contributions. And we hope you enjoyed the program today.
Yeah.
And if there's anybody that has any comments or questions, otherwise,
So
happy holidays.
yeah,
Yeah.
happy holidays, everyone. So we'll post the full recording in the next couple of days, and we'll also post the different resources that we talked about. If you want to read Cottages and Villas, we'll put a copy of that up on our website, as well as the links to the Preservation Society, and other relevant info. So we love if you have any questions, but otherwise we will see you in the new year. We just want to say thank you so much to everybody for your support during 2021. We're looking forward to a better 2022. And we couldn't have gotten this far without your generous support and encouragement. And so we just want to say thank you to everybody. So
And we look forward to learning from and with all of you in the coming year and exploring New York City together virtually and in person.
yeah.
So stay safe and healthy. We're thinking of all of you and we're so grateful for your support.
All right. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.